Okay, so here we are. We're beginning our crash course on Jewish tradition, and I'm really excited to be beginning this course and this kind of section of your education because I think in terms of the four areas which I've identified as the foundation areas of knowledge that every Jew should have down, which is the Torah, the Jewish holidays, and Jewish history, I think of the four, this one is unlike the others because the Torah, all Jews know that there's the 5 books of Moses, there's no discrepancy on that. And of course, the holidays, albeit there's different levels of connection to the holidays, we know what the holidays are. For the most part, they may be observed in different ways, but we share the same holidays and understand that. And clearly, our history is a history. But when it comes to understanding Jewish tradition, I think this is the one area where a wide swath of the Jewish people have just lost a connection to what exactly is our tradition all about. How does it work? What are the elements to it? How does it get passed on? And I think there's the greatest mystery about Jewish tradition. In fact, I remember I was once at a conference in London. I was presenting all my crash courses, and I did the crash course in Torah and the holidays and history. But the one that actually had people outside the room, meaning it was packed to the point that people were in the hall standing on chairs, which was a huge surprise for me, was the crash course on Talmud, where I went through the entire overview of the Talmud in that session. I just think there's a lot of curiosity, and unfortunately it's an unknown. So our goal here is to make it very well understood, and hopefully something that you'll have a greater connection to, because you're going to see this is where really the meat and life and vitality of Jewish learning, Jewish living, everything's kind of locked up here, and therefore it's important that you feel very comfortable. All right, so in this session, we're going to focus on the fact that the Jewish people have 2 Torahs. And I think this is something which people don't realize. They're used to knowing there's the Torah scroll, which they, pull out, in synagogue at a service and read part of the Torah reading. But there are actually 2 Torahs, and this is serious. It's not like there's not a cute thing, but there really are 2 Torahs. One is written and one is oral. Now, Torah literally means instructions. Harot amorah, or moreh is a teacher. Well, harot is to teach. And instructor, because an instructor understands the structure of something and therefore he instructs. So the Torah actually is 2 parts. There's the written Torah and there's the oral Torah. The oral Torah means that it's a tradition, it's an understanding or a body of knowledge, I should say, which is passed on orally. It's not written down. Now, the difference between the 2 Torahs is the written Torah, which we're going to see is referring to the 5 books of Moses. That's where we have the list of the commandments. And we're going to go through an overview of the commandments and the different types of commandments. But in the 5 books of Moses, we have the list of 613 different commandments. But in the oral Torah, we actually learn about how to do those commandments. We have all those commandments in detail. So the written Torah lists the commandments, gives us a very brief, verse or two, sometimes a little bit more, but by no means comprehensive in the Torah itself. And then the oral tradition is where we're going to get the explanation of how to do these commandments. And the understanding is that these were both handed to Moses at Mount Sinai. In fact, the verse in the Torah says in the book of Exodus, where it goes through the giving of the Torah, it says, "Come up to me to the mountain." That's God talking to Moses. "Come up to me to the mountain. I will give you the Torah and the commandments." The Torah and the commandments. So there's 2 elements. The Torah referring to the written Torah, and the commandments referring to the oral tradition, which explains on how to observe all the different commandments. And there's another hint to the fact that an oral tradition exists, because God tells Moses later on in the book of Deuteronomy, which is the 5th book of the Torah, in chapter 12, verse 21, he says, "You shall slaughter your cattle as I have commanded you." Now, if you go through the 5 books of Moses, nowhere will you see the instructions on how one is supposed to slaughter a cow or a calf or a goat or a sheep. There's nowhere. This doesn't exist anywhere. And yet there's a reference to, "You shall slaughter your cattle as I've commanded you." So clearly there's another body of knowledge which Moses commanded, but it's not written down in the form of the 5 books of Moses. That's the oral tradition. And besides the reference and the allusion to the fact that it exists, you'll see that when you read the written Torah, you see that you need an oral tradition. You need God to explain what did he mean when he wrote things down. Because let's just take the verse for observing the Sabbath. This is from the Exodus, from the 10 Commandments. This is the 4th commandment. 6 days you shall work, and the 7th day is Shabbat, the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On that day you shall not do any work. Okay, now, what does it mean that something's a Shabbat or the Sabbath to the Lord? Well, it doesn't say. What does it mean on that day you shall not do any work? Well, what does work mean? Does that mean that you can't, if you're a therapist, sit down and talk to someone, you can't do work? Does that mean you can't get paid? Does it mean that you can't, let's say, carry furniture around your house and get all sweated up and exert yourself? Does it refer to medicine? Like what is it referring to work? Well, it doesn't tell us. It gives us a word, malacha, but it doesn't tell us exactly what it is. So the definitions of what was meant in these verses, by definition, requires an oral tradition. God has to tell Moses, this is what I mean when I say a Shabbat to your Lord. This is exactly what I'm talking about in terms of a day of rest. Doesn't mean you sleep all day. This is what you're meant to do, and this is what you're not meant to do by the work. So by necessity, you can't understand any of the written Torah, or very little of the written Torah, without having God explain to Moses what he meant by that. So that's the oral Torah. Written Torah versus the oral Torah. Written Torah lists the commandments, oral Torah explains them. So where do we find the written Torah? Well, it's in the Torah scroll, which is known as well as the 5 books of Moses. That's the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And for more on that, just go back up to the Crash Course in Torah, where I go through that. It's also referred to as the Chumash. Chumash is Hebrew for 5. So it's the 5 books, just the Hebrew version. Pentateuch is late Latin based on the late Greek. Penta is, late Greek for 5, penta, and tuch is Greek for scroll, like 5 scrolls. So it's the same idea. So whether you're picking up a Pentateuch, a Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, or Torah scroll, it's one and the same. But that's where we have the list of all the different commandments. And we'll go, more in detail through this, in upcoming videos. The oral Torah was originally oral, meaning it was something that was passed on, rabbi to student, father, mother to child. It was passed on parent to child. And it was preserved that way for 1,500 years. And then at some point, which we're going to get into, it was written down. It was written down because, in short, it was too hard to remember this vast body of knowledge just through mere memory. So to ensure that the Jewish people would be successful in passing it down, especially in light of the exile, which was just at its beginning stages, the 2,000-year-long exile, the Jewish people. So the oral Torah was written down. So the books that you're going to hear about, references, are the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the Midrash, or Midrashim. That's plural. But this is where you're going to find the old tradition today. It's written down into these volumes of law, which are quite extensive. And that's why if you've ever been to a seminary, to a yeshiva, and you hear people learning, most of the time they're learning the oral tradition. And that's why it's so noisy in there, because people are discussing it, explaining it. It's still preserved an oral element to it. And we'll talk about why there needed to be an oral tradition in an upcoming video as well. But I just want to clarify, there are 2 Torahs. So what's happened, unfortunately for us, I think in our generation, is that people are aware of the 5 books of Moses, but they've become somewhat estranged from understanding this other element of the Torah, the second Torah, which is the Mishnah, Talmud, and Midrashim, and so on. And that's really where the body of Jewish law, religion, ideas, concepts are here. Just if you had to compare on a percentage scale, one versus the other, the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, that's about 1% of our tradition that's there. The other 99% you're going to find in the oral Torah. You're going to find in the Mishnah, Talmud, and Midrashim. So if someone wants to be connected, it's very important to build a strong foundation, understanding what this is all about, why it's so, and then how it's organized, and what's the interplay. And we're going to look at that. What's the connection? How exactly do they work between each other? The written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and the Mishnah, Talmud, and the Midrash, and so on. So that is an introduction to the idea of 2 Torahs, because we need to understand that as the basic building blocks to understanding the nature of Jewish tradition. Okay, so let's do a little review. So we said the Jewish people have 2 Torahs. We have the written Torah and we have the oral Torah. The written Torah is where we have the list of the 613 commandments. In the oral Torah, we explain or we learn all the details of the commandments. As it says, come up to me to the mountain, I'll give you the Torah and the commandments. Not the Torah with the commandments, the Torah and the commandments, One, the Torah is a allusion to the written Torah, and the commandments refers to the oral tradition. Right? It says also, you shall slaughter your cattle as if it commanded you, but nowhere in the Torah does it say anywhere what the laws are, because that's a reference to the oral Torah. And we said, just by definition, you need to have an oral Torah to give the definitions of things, such as 6 days you shall work, and the 7th day is Shabbat to the Lord. Well, what is Shabbat? On that day you shall not do any work. What is work? You need an oral tradition, an oral Torah to explain that, and that's not from the rabbis, which we're going to see. The written Torah is found, that's the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash Pentateuch. It's the same book. It's the Torah scroll, just different names, where the oral Torah is found in what's known as the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the Midrashim. Okay, so that's the basic building block, and now we're going to get into why there had to be an oral Torah in addition to what we pointed out here so far.